Our story begins with a trip into Boston on a very humid September 11th, 2013. A handful of Beverly residents make the trip in to the Massachusetts Historical Commission to comment on the nomination of the Beverly Depot area to the National Register of Historic Places.
This is dipped down. You can see the harbor from here.
So here we are, the intrepid defenders of Beverly's history.
And the Archives building, which was made to look like it was part of Boston Harbor originally. What do you know?
I think it worked.
Susie Lamont, Peter Johnson, and I made the trip in together. We were later joined by Sean Cahill. In February 2013, the Massachusetts Historical Commission sent an opinion to Windover stating that if they tore down the former Hotel Trafton and Cushing Carriage Factory, then you could no longer have a district, that a key piece of the puzzle that made up that district would be gone, and they would lose their tax credits. Peter Johnson wondered what would happen to the National Register nomination if the buildings that made up that historic resource were gone. Officials at the Massachusetts Historical Commission really didn't have an answer for us. They said this was merely a first step in the process. In March, Windover requested a meeting with the Beverly Historic District Commission to discuss their nomination. The attorney for Windover, Miranda Gooding, said that they were now taking the strategy of exploring all options to save both buildings. They would see what it would take to incorporate both buildings into a new development on that site. Although this was no guarantee that both buildings would be saved. Lee Dellicker also spoke about this at the Massachusetts Historical Commission hearing.
We are looking very hard at every building in that area, and whatever we can do to preserve what we can preserve, we are committed to this district to do what we can.
But again, this was no guarantee. It was a very strange hearing because in addition to Windover's nomination, there were other buildings being nominated to the National Register that day. And these nominations came from concerned citizens, preservation groups, historical societies, as a way of encouraging the historical assets in question. And here in Beverly, we were being asked to put the cart before the horse. We were speaking on whether a district should be created, not knowing what would happen to the resources that made up that district. Then it was my turn to speak, and while I had tacit support for creating this district, I also questioned Windover's sincerity in keeping this district intact and preserving both buildings. But I felt my comments were a little too negative, and I wanted to get Lee Dellicker's side of things. So after the hearing, I approached him and asked, would you come on this show to be interviewed? And he agreed to do it. So before we sat down to do this interview, Lee Dellicker wanted to meet with me. So I suddenly found myself at Windover's headquarters in Manchester by the Sea. It was there I met local Beverly architect Thaddeus Amasco, who does a lot of work for Windover. Now they had plans on what they have envisioned for redevelopment in the Beverly Depot area. I was impressed with some things. Other things rubbed me the wrong way. But I was there really to get knowledge on what his perspective was, what a developer had to deal with. And I told him, if you come on my show, there won't be any shock questions and I'm not going to ambush you. I'm going to let you come on this show and give your side of the story because that's something I think Beverly residents haven't really seen before. And we'll leave it up to the audience to make up their own minds about this interview. Thank you for joining us. We are pleased to have from Windover Construction Development, Lee Dellicker. Good to have you here.
Nice to be here. Thank you.
So the first question, you had said the first video had some inaccuracies in it. What were those inaccuracies? I'm curious to see from your point of view, from a developer's point of view, looking at a preservationist video. What did you think about the video, and what were some of those inaccuracies?
First of all, I just want to say thank you for having me here. I do appreciate the opportunity to be talking about this stuff because it's often that I get misinterpreted. So I very much appreciate the opportunity. It's actually been some time since I've watched the video, so I can't sit here and point out particular statements that I felt were inaccurate. I'd have to say, Matt, I think the thing that really got me was that it came across as if I didn't care about the building, or that we were just making plans no matter what, and that there was just the feeling that, you know, bar the doors, we're just going through, and that we didn't care. And I think when we met before, as sure as I'm sitting right here, the video did a lot of good things. It did bring some of the attention to me that I didn't know. I had no clue that that building had the history behind it that you pointed out. So that was a very, very positive thing I thought came out of the video. What got under my skin a little bit was the feeling that I got when I watched it that, okay, along comes this guy who doesn't care about any of this and is just going to plow this building down. And part of the reason I'm sitting here today is because that just isn't true.
And that's one of the reasons why I think it's important to have you on this show, because there's a lot that's swirling around in the city of Beverly on what Windover is. Do you steal sidewalks was another accusation. We'll go into that later. I want to talk about the demolition delay hearing. It was something where we have these boards set up. They identify what could be potentially historic buildings that have a community value. And your comments were basically saying, you know, I'll wait the 1 year, I can live with the 1 year, then after that I'm taking the buildings down. I've asked people what they've thought about those statements, and it didn't sound very favorable on your part. Could you explain what was going on in your mind when you talked about those buildings during that demolition delay hearing?
Sure.
With those statements.
I'm happy to. And I think some of those statements come from the fact that I probably know a lot more about the building than maybe other people do. For example, I mentioned to you that even through your video, I've been learning more about the history of the building. Even when I went to that first demolition delay, you have to understand, I've been trying to buy that building for 5 years or more. And my impression of what the community thought of that building was it was a rundown bar that shouldn't exist. The rooming house was, the conditions, I know the city put a lot of pressure to improve the conditions of that building. And my honest opinion for a long time was that we were going to be doing the city and the neighborhood a favor by taking this old rundown place down. So that's been in my mind for a long time. I've also, having been in the building, recognized, in addition to a developer and a contractor, I started my career as a licensed, and still am a licensed structural engineer, so I can walk through a building and tell what it's going to take to rehab it. And so I think I made the assumptions that, look, I just don't think this building can be torn down. And it was not an in-your-face, I'm tearing it down no matter what. I realized what's probably going to happen here. And the reason I backed up at the second demolition delay was I did learn a lot more about the building, and I did realize, you know what, I'll go back. I think I know the answer, which was really where my statement was coming from, but I'm not going to try to push this through. I will wait the time, and as I think someone on the commission said, they've seen other buildings that have gone through this, that just by giving it a little bit more time, there might be something that someone hadn't thought about, and I was willing to do that.
Now, something that was also a little bit of controversy, you were doing a good job developing the box factory building, and you sought tax credits. Now, the building cannot be individually listed to get those tax credits, so you had to create a historic district or a National Register district of the Beverly Depot area. Mm-hmm. And people thought that just didn't make any sense, that you were creating something and you were going to knock down 2 historic buildings. The Mass Historic Commission said those 2 buildings really are an essential part of the district, and if they were torn down, it really wouldn't be a district anymore. Could you talk about the process of trying to create this district and your motivations behind it?
Happy to. Now remember, through this same time frame, is the same time frame for the demolition delay hearings, is I'm learning a lot about these buildings that I didn't know before. So just file that away for a second. That's correct. We sort of by accident, I don't know if you recall, but that building was originally, when we bought it, covered with a very odd colored brown metal siding, mm-hmm. and looked like an old metal building. And I don't think a lot of people, unless they saw it before the metal siding went up, probably ever realized that the building as it is today even existed under that. There were no windows in the metal. It was just a metal brown box. So when we discovered that there was some nice things under this with the granite lintels and the brickwork that's there, during the construction of Depot Square, we realized let's get this metal siding off. Let's fix this up. I don't know if you remember, but we put plywood panels in, but we painted them a nice green and we put a little accent to try to dress it up a little bit. Selfishly, is because we didn't want people buying condos from us that were looking at this ugly brown metal building. We said let's try to dress it up a little bit while we try to figure out what we can do in the long term with that building. In the middle of all this, there was a lot of controversy about where the MBTA garage was going to go. Ultimately, the MBTA decided the best place for the garage is on the land that we owned, which used to be a city parking lot. And the state went through an eminent domain process to take that land from us to build a garage that's under construction today. That left us with a building. 60 Pleasant Street is the address, this brick building, where the property lines are the building. There is no other land. So we went to work to try to figure out what can we do with this building. At one time we thought about putting our own offices there, but the building had no parking. And just because a parking garage was going, that's a commuter garage, that wasn't going to be acceptable for parking my 70 employees. So we had to rule that out because of parking. And then we started, we through a variety of people and circumstances, we've got introduced to the Veterans Administration, who is on a mission to create supportive housing for homeless veterans. We now, again, a whole nother story, we are now a major player with the VA. We've created veterans housing in Morristown, New Jersey, the project here in Beverly, Bedford, Brockton, Manchester, New Hampshire. I mean, this is a big program. But this was a great spot. The VA was very excited about this spot because we're right on the train station to provide services. So now we're faced with how do we create affordable housing. We started looking for funding sources to do this. Now remember, we had already taken the metal off, and the only way that we could do this was put together a variety of public funding sources and private sources. I mean, we got Home Depot to contribute $250,000 towards the project because they believed in what we were doing for the veterans, et cetera. And one of those sources was the historic tax credit program. And we frankly thought the building was really cool, really old, and probably would qualify for the building itself for registration. Mass Historic and the feds didn't necessarily agree, but they did agree, much like your video says, that this whole area has a lot of history to it, and clearly this is part of what contributed to the history of the whole area. So in order for us to qualify, and since we couldn't qualify the building, it had to be part of this area. Well, now we're faced with a decision because we don't own most of the buildings in this district that Mass Historic decided could be registered. Mm-hmm. And how do you go about doing a district when you might own a couple of buildings but you don't own them all? So we went through a process to learn that we could do it. Now we did all the research that Mass Historic required on behalf of ourselves and the other property owners. But the first thing we had to look at was, well, if I'm another property owner, is this a good thing or a bad thing? And what we learned, or what we were told at the time, was nobody should really think this is a bad thing to be part of this district, because it does two things. If you're part of the district and you own a building in the district, we've already done the homework for you. You automatically will qualify potentially for some of these government programs that could potentially help you pay for some of these historic restorations. So from that perspective, all our neighbors should be very happy about this. The other thing that we learned is that it only comes into play. It will never be a bad thing, and that you can still do anything you want to your building within a district, but don't use any state or federal money, because if you do, then you come under the qualifications that you have to meet the historic guidelines and you have to go through that process. So that was the reason we did the district. That was the reason it was to qualify for the tax credits that are available. And even for the other buildings that we owned, we thought, well, this isn't a bad thing, because if we're not using state or federal money, then it doesn't affect the other buildings that we have anyway. And again, remember, when we started this process, I had not seen your video. I had no clue there was anybody in this city that thought that building was historic. I had no clue. So all this stuff has evolved over time. And yes, it killed me to see the headline that developer creates historic district and then goes try to tear down half the buildings in it. It was just a series of events that happened, and things and misinformation that I had over time that I've been slowly trying to figure out what the right thing to do within this district is.
Okay, because from my point of view as someone, I'm not a preservation expert, not an expert in history, but I've spent a lot of time learning from people who know the history of Beverly and railroad history. So you do learn a few things about the buildings. Now, you hired Epsilon Associates to fill out the application. Mm-hmm. What I don't understand, looking at the first application, he's trying to say the Hotel Trafton has lost its historic integrity, so it shouldn't be included in the district. I believe it was 2008, the Mass Historic Commission said the building, as bad as it is, still retains its historic integrity. I'm trying to understand how he came to the conclusion that, well, it really isn't historic, when other people have said throughout the years that it is historic, even though it's lost its ornamentation. Did he ever look at the 2008 opinion at Mass Historic?
You know what? I would be speaking for him. I don't know the answer to that. You know, to the extent of some of that might have been tainted by me in the early days, where I thought this was an old bar and rooming house that most everybody wanted to go. You know, was he influenced by that? Could be. I mean, I think you'd have to ask him. From my perspective, I had the expert on my team, since I am certainly not a historic expert nor a tax credit expert. I had somebody on my team that was advising me on the right thing to do. So I do think, though, Matt, that whether or not there are some of the historic details still intact or not, that the decision as to whether this can be rehabilitated, restored, or whatever, is a much more encompassing decision. It involves a lot more than just a few details that may be intact. We have new building codes, we have egress requirements, we have structural requirements, we have building wind load, earthquake loads, all things that we have to build to these days, that sometimes these old buildings just can't be accommodated in an economic fashion. So it's, in fairness, he has one piece of it. Mm-hmm. But my architect and my engineers have a whole other piece of it, that even if all those details were there, can we make it meet all of today's current requirements and still make the numbers work?
Someone at the demolition delay hearing had said, we approved the CPA, we're a CPA community. He felt that meant that the voters spoke about preservation, that Beverly really is a community that wants to see preservation and not have things get torn down. And it was almost like a mandate. What do you think about that statement?
Yeah, I think what little I know about the CPA, I think that there are a lot of really good things that fund of money can do. I don't know personally how it gets administered and who decides what projects that goes towards, but I think it's historic preservation, but I also think it's projects that are just for the good of the community in one way or another. So I don't think it's designed just for historic preservation.
Open space and affordable housing and historic preservation, I think, are the three planks that make up CPA.
Yeah.
We had CPA people telling us it's a way to preserve historic landscapes in Beverly, which was one of the three things the CPA was intended to do. So naturally, some of the CPA people that were holding up signs came out to the demolition delay hearing and thought it was a little counter to what we had just voted for in Beverly, that here we are talking about creating a district and knocking down a few historic buildings, and yet they were saying, vote for the CPA because it preserves historic landscapes.
I think my best answer to that, Matt, is kind of what's come from you and I now speaking and actually having this discussion, is that I think there's a lot of tools out there that may help the situation. The basic problem is still very simple. You know, there are people who could be very passionate about what that building used to be, but it has to work economically for me. It has to be something that if I have to work into a pro forma and make it work. Now, that's the whole reason that a program like the Historic Tax Credit Program was done, is that if there are ways, CPA could be another one, if there are ways where no one program can solve the whole project, but if there are tools like that that we can throw into the mix that can make things happen that I couldn't do as a simply private developer, then absolutely, let's talk about it. But I am not aware, when I'm looking at potentially millions of dollars of gaps between a feasible project and a not feasible project, how a little bit of CPA money might make the difference. So I just think that there just has to be reality that that's one tool, and let's talk and let's figure out if that can be used, but then what are the others to make it happen. That building over at 60 Pleasant Street, the Veterans Housing Project, could not have happened had not a lot of different things happened. I mentioned Home Depot. I didn't mention, but we have HUD money, we have tax credit money, we have low-income tax credit money in addition to the historic tax credit money. I never ever could have pulled that off unless I put all these little tools together to make the economics work. And I would say my response to the CPA would be, yes, I understand the mission, and perhaps that this is one tool that can apply here, but it's not going to be the silver bullet that's going to just change the entire project.
Okay, and dovetailing that comment, another theme you heard at the demolition delay hearing was people said, well, you're using all these tools for one building. Could some of these tools be used for the other buildings? And I think it was Wendy Pearl on the commission said, we just had an election and we have the CPA and there may be other tools available. That's a concern that people have, that if you're using all this, you're getting funding from here and there, could that be applied to the other two buildings?
Again, same answer before. Yes, possibly. Even though we've created this district, it doesn't automatically mean every single building in the district is going to qualify for all of the same funding sources that I had over at 60 Pleasant Street, for example. I'm not proposing that I build affordable housing on the block where the press box now sits. That would probably be more market rate housing. Well, I won't qualify for low income tax credits. I won't qualify for veterans funding. Are there other programs that, I might qualify for historic tax credits, but I'm going to be under the same scrutiny for that building as I was for the 60 Pleasant Street building. Is, well, how many tax credits is it worth? What are you doing, and what's the historic nature? So I can't tell you today, A, if they would ever be approved, and B, at what level they would be approved. There's just a lot of missing pieces. So statements like that hey, there could be a lot of relief to make this happen are great and are true, but it's going to be where the rubber meets the road as to what does it actually qualify for.
Okay. Have you do you know of any grant programs or assistance for developers for encouraging smart growth? Is that something that was in Beverly Main Street's Downtown 2020? They said actively seek funding for smart growth opportunities and historic preservation too, whether it's private or state funds. Or
the answer is yes, and I'm slowly learning about what these programs are. I'm actually there's a smart growth development conference that's being put on by the state of Massachusetts in Worcester in early December, where I plan on learning more about the kinds of programs that excuse me, may be available for for this kind of thing. So the answer is yes, I have heard, like you have, that there are programs out there. I do not know the specifics or how they're going to play into what we might want to do.
Now, what determines the size of a building? People in Beverly were talking about building very tall buildings in the Beverly Depot area. We had many hearings on the Tiff, which is a tax incentive to basically spur development, a certain kind of development in the Beverly Depot area. So what would determine that? Because I notice you're not building big buildings like the kind that you had envisioned many years ago.
Mm-hmm. What really determines the size of a project, believe it or not, is parking. When you're in a transit-oriented spot like we have down at the depot, you don't need as much parking because the proven theory is that people that live in these places tend to have fewer cars. But still, parking ends up governing the size of the project. When we were envisioning 450 units, parking was still governing that. But at the time, because the economy was still strong and housing prices were still high, we could justify, for example, we could go down underground, which is costly to create parking. But we felt that the unit prices that we could get would justify that cost. Well, now we're in a different world. And so we have to balance what we think we can sell a unit for with the cost of creating the parking that we need, which ultimately would determine the unit count. So, for example, just up the street from here, where Enterprise Rent-A-Car used to be, we now call that Enterprise Apartments. We had to look at that site. We had to determine what we thought the right amount of parking was. As you know, in Beverly, they have the district that if you're close to the train station, they will allow you to go down to as few as 1 per unit. We believe through our research that that is plenty, but I would never go less than 1 because I just can't lease units if I can't give at least 1 parking space. So we developed a plan to determine how much parking we could get relatively economically to keep our rents at a market level. That number was about 45 spaces. Then we go and design a building that has 45 units in it, and that's how we do it. So the size of the building really, unfortunately, is still determined by how many parking spaces you can figure out.
Someone on the Facebook page asked, what do you want people to say about your developments, about the architecture that you bring to Beverly, and what do you think in 50 years from now people will say about the buildings that you do build?
Well, we've always taken a lot of pride in the buildings that we build and work very, very hard to fit them into the context of the neighborhood, the scale of the neighborhood. I know that there are some critics that may or may not think that we've done that in some cases, and I think there are some cases where we've done it better than others. But what do I want people to say? I want people to say the same thing that I'm starting to hear now is, first of all, that we're well-intentioned. We do what we say we're going to do. We worry about the space that we create. We worry about the neighborhoods that we're in. And I believe we do all that. And if that's the reputation that we have, I'd be very, very happy.
Now, you had mentioned with the Burnham Apartments that the city was telling you, we should do this here, and then another city group was telling you, no, we shouldn't do this, and you took their recommendations, and then you had people wondering, well, why did you do this instead of this? And could you elaborate on that, please?
Yeah, a couple of examples I think would help there.
Okay.
One example is there was a lot of criticism about why is the building right on the street. Well, if you look at the design review guidelines, it really wants to promote buildings that are right up in the street. We thought we could push it back a little bit. The design review really felt, and I think they're right, frankly, that you want to create in a downtown area that. So one of the criticisms we have is why didn't we push it back from the street? Well, because we were trying to meet the guidelines in the city, and we did have discussions about that through the process. So I think it's unfair when people come out and say, that I did it by myself. Number one. Number two is, we had one time had proposed a bunch of planters along the building just to soften the building along there. Rightly so. I think some of the people in the city were concerned that it was a maintenance issue and others. So those planters were eliminated. The next thing I heard, on the street was, why couldn't they put planters in? I said, well, I would have been happy to, but through the process, everybody decided they really weren't a good idea. So that's where I think the one-sided stuff comes in, is that don't just assume that, the big bad developer just didn't do it because he didn't want to spend money on it. That's just not the case. If I could comment on that building, because some of the criticism I've had over that building is, geez, it's not a great looking building. I personally disagree. I think it's a pretty good looking building, but it was also designed to, first of all, to be in the context of the neighborhood. The materials were a little bit less. If you notice, I'm using brick down at the Enterprise Apartments because there's a lot of brick in that area. There isn't up in that area. I'll be honest with you. I see what some of the critics say. I think there are some things, even with some color or some awnings or other, maybe some additional planters that can be moved in the wintertime, can do to just give that building a little bit more pizzazz. Once people started bringing it to my attention, and I started looking at it, I looked at it and said, you're right. And I went back to our architect and said, I think we missed it on a couple of things here. Let's fix it. So we are in the process of planning awnings for the building. We're going to, put a little more punch in some of the accent stripes, which I think would make a huge difference to the building. So some of the criticism where we just built as cheap a building as we possibly could, I think, again, are unfair.
What things irritate you about doing business in Beverly, or frustrate you, or you'd like to see changed?
First of all, I think it's important to say that I understand the process and I appreciate the process and I understand the importance of it, and I am happy to go through it. Tell me what the rules are. I'll do my darndest to play by those rules. And I think if you really ask me what frustrates me about the process, isn't any one particular board, isn't any of the people. I have a lot of respect. I have served in a couple of those boards in other communities, and I really appreciate the time that and energy that they put into them. What frustrates for me, and particularly in Beverly, and I think that I do a lot of permitting in other communities that I don't see this, is you go through one board and you have a certain set of criteria and requirements. Then you go to another board and you make the same presentation over again, and they might have a different set of opinions and you have a different outcome. Well, if your approval before was conditional upon certain things, you go back to that other board, and it's just a back and forth. I firmly believe that the process could be streamlined by getting some sort of system together that gets these boards kind of talking to each other. Somebody come in and decide whether or not my project is, in general, good or bad for the community. And if you think it's good for the community, what is the process? How do we talk together to try to figure out how we get to a positive outcome for everybody? Not just me. I want to understand the rules. So I frankly think it's not fair, some of the things that have been said about, I'm driving things and, I'm trying not to. There are some things in the code that I think benefited. Yes, did they benefit me? But they also benefited the whole area. I thought that if you really wanted, back when you go back to the 70-foot zone change, that wasn't just our property. Yes, I supported it, and it did benefit us. There was no hiding that. But I truly believed that if that whole area had that kind of flexibility, you would get a whole series of buildings. It wouldn't be all, a canyon of 70-foot tall buildings, but it would give flexibility to be able to get some cool buildings because, again, it's economics. Sometimes for me, it's unit count. If I have to pay a lot for the ground, I have to get more units that I can sell at a marketable price to make it work. So I just felt that from an economic development standpoint, allow a developer to make a little bit of money on his project, that's not a bad thing if it leads to an overall area that I think will help the overall economic development of the area. I want more developers to come into Beverly. I don't want to be one of the only ones that's trying to do work here. Everything, the Tiff, the parking discussions that I've been involved in, the tall building discussions that I've been involved in, have been focused on a region, not just our projects.
Now, you had said to me earlier, you don't think the TIF zone will ever be used by developers. Just from your point of view as a developer, how it was written. I mean, it was a very controversial thing. Could you go into that, some of the things that you told me earlier about the Tiff and why you don't think you would probably use it?
I don't think in its current form that it's going to make a lot of sense for us to use. First of all, I really encourage the people that were considering it at the time to make sure that the rules along the Tiff aren't subject to the political process. I think if you ask any developer what's important to them, the word certainty of outcome will come out. Is that if I am a developer looking at Beverly, and just if I'm just don't know anything about Beverly, I just say, you know, I've heard it's kind of a cool community, then the first thing I'm going to do is go in and try to understand what the rules are and determine what it is. People don't realize it's very expensive to go through the permitting process to do the design and to pay the lawyers and pay the architects and all this stuff to do. So you got to kind of understand that you got a chance to succeed before you make the decision to even come into your community. And I thought that there was too much of the regulations that really were, here's some guidelines, but you got to really kind of go and talk to the mayor, go to the city council, and to determine what the parameters will actually be. That's number one. The reason I don't think it will attract outside developers. The more important thing is, I believe this is state regulated, not necessarily city regulated, is there is a 25% affordable housing component in the TIF. Mm-hmm. And while I'm a supporter of affordable housing, it's still a matter of economics. And for me to create a project that has 25% that I'm limited on either what I can sell or lease them for will hurt the economics. So if I look and see the benefit of the TIF versus the downside of the numbers on the 25% affordable, it wipes it out. So any benefit that we thought might come from the TIF will be wiped out by the affordable component.
Now, you've said many times you have to make money as a developer. Just looking at that, what you called the small block, the block that has the Casa de Luca, the former Hotel Traffic, Cushing Carriage, what are the economics that go into a project for that block, and how much would you have to make? Like, what is considered making a good profit and what's considered cost prohibitive? I'm assuming you would not build something and maybe break even in the first year and then start to make your money down the road. I think people have no idea how these things are funded, so could you go into that?
It's probably a little more detailed than you want to get into in your show here.
Okay.
But let me...
Do you even take out loans, or
yeah.
is the funding come from in-house, or?
No. Okay. We finance all of these projects with banks.
Okay.
The banks will require a certain amount of equity in the projects, but most of them the majority of these projects are financed through bank financing. So you've got to be able to pay the money. You got to be able to pay it back. You got to be able to pay the interest. I think the best way is that we focus on two types of projects. There's the rental projects, which are apartments, and there's the for sale projects. So we build condominiums and we sell them. Now, the condominium is almost easier when you ask yourself, how do you make money in it? It's very simple. You buy the land, you build the building, and you sell units. And when you've sold them all, you hope that you have more money in your pocket than it costs you to do all those things. It's very simple math, and we strive to make sure that we can pay all our expenses. All my people have paychecks. We pay for them, and we like to have a small margin after that. I think one of the this is probably a dangerous statement, Matt, but it is very, very true. Is that we get perceived, Windover in general, as just out there. We get deep pockets, and all we want to do is make as much money as we possibly can. I got to tell you, that is just not true. And we can point to projects in Beverly and other areas where we are trying to do the right thing and not focused on making money. We try to make sure we cover our costs and have some percentage beyond that, reasonable margins beyond that any business that anybody that's in business tries to make. It's I tell my clients all the time, I try to make a little bit of money a lot of times repeat business, repeat clients. On a rental project now, we have apartments that we rent over time. So you can take a little bit, on a rental project, you can take a little bit more of a long-term view, because with time, rents will go up. And your costs, you hope your costs don't go up as fast as your rents go up. So we can make decisions sometimes on a rental project to make a little bit less money in the early years and hope that you can make it up in the back time. But if it's a for sale project, you don't have that. You're trying to sell those right now, and you make your money or don't on day one.
Now, also, getting back to the stolen sidewalk, people in this city will accuse you of stealing a sidewalk. Can you talk about that and maybe clear something up?
Probably one of my most frustrating experiences in my working with the city of Beverly. The story is a very, very simple one. Is that during the design and the permitting process, there was a sidewalk shown. There was a city sidewalk there before we bought the property. There was a sidewalk shown on the plans that got approved. There was no question. I never said that there wasn't. If you recall, this is Pleasant Street we're talking about, and part of the design is there's a one of the lower level parking garages empties onto Pleasant Street. The other thing that was really almost missed by both my engineers and the city people was the fact that this sidewalk, it was very steep and is continued to be steep. And I was the first one that brought it to the city engineer's attention to say, we're happy to put this sidewalk in, but it's very, very steep, and there's cars exiting out from this garage, and it just doesn't feel, particularly in the wintertime, like a very safe condition. Should we look at something else? Again, I'm happy to build it exactly the way we approved it, but we all might want to take a look at this. And through a joint effort between me, my civil engineer, and the city engineer, we came up together with a concept that put handicap ramps on Rantoul Street, that put a new crosswalk across Pleasant Street, and then he asked us if we would demolish and reconstruct all the sidewalks on the other side of Pleasant Street, where, even believe it or not, on the other side, the way the grade is, it's less steep on the other side, and we would encourage people to cross and then walk down. And frankly, then they're already on the other side. Most of these people are headed to the train station anyway. So there was a discussion with the engineers that all got approved. We did a sketch. We sent it to the city. It got approved. What we later found out was that perhaps the city engineer didn't realize that he should have involved the city council in that process. I didn't know it. The city engineer didn't know it. So next thing you know is we were trying to discourage people from walking out by putting in a planting strip where that sidewalk used to be. Next thing I knew, there was a headline, developer tries to steal city sidewalk. We didn't. It was in the interest of safety, and it was, ironically, it was through working with it very closely with the city of Beverly.
I think citizens of Beverly only see the developers at public hearings, and we have no idea who they are in real life. So one of the things that I've noticed at some of these hearings, people come out, especially at the Brimble Ave hearing, will come out and say things about developers, and they have in their mind what they think developers are. What goes on in your mind when you sit at these hearings? Like the Tiff Zone hearings were interesting because a lot of people had a lot of negative things to say. What goes on in your mind when you sit there and people are throwing criticisms at you, just from a human interest question?
I'm not going to lie to you. Sometimes those meetings can be intimidating, and sometimes they can be downright hurtful. And there are times when you just want to throw up your hands and say, you know, I am trying to do the right thing here, and yet I'm getting people that just either don't listen or have their own opinions that are stronger, and they just come out. And I hope, Matt, that I've proven to you that, and for those of you that don't know, I've got to give Matt a lot of credit. At the end of a Mass Historic meeting, Matt was the one that approached me and said, can we talk? And I am very grateful for you doing that, because hopefully you are seeing another side of me, that I'm not a big bad developer, that we do try to do the right thing. So when I wish that everybody in that in those forums could get that same idea, because we are working very, very hard and to try to do the right things. And some of the criticism we get is it's hard. And I mean, I think your impression is right. I mean, I don't know the vibes that I give off on those meetings, but there are times I try to just sit there and keep a straight face, and there are other times when I'm just like, oh, you got to be kidding me! I just want to crawl under the table and just walk out. So,
Well, when you see hearings like the Brimble Land project, I mean, these issues affect people. They'll say, this is my quality of life. What you're building affects me personally because it's in my backyard. And another comment on Facebook is, how do you address that you don't live next to what you build and you don't have to put up with the things that you're creating? How do you address that criticism?
well, what a lot of people may not realize is that the very first thing, I don't know if all developers do this, but I do it. The very first thing I do is have a neighborhood meeting and to try to talk about, here's what I want to propose. And we did that at the Burnham Apartments, we did it at the Enterprise Apartments, we did it at Depot Square. We have always done it. We do it in Rowley, in Gloucester, in Manchester. It's the first step. And why is that? Is that I want to hear this stuff. I want to hear what it is that concerns you. And it's like, don't just tell me you don't like it. Tell me why you don't like it, and what are the issues? Because if I don't understand the whys, I can't do anything to modify it. So we do take a lot of steps to try to do that. Now, if the answer is I just don't want anything built there, that I think that's a little bit unreasonable. Time does march on, and change is inevitable in all our lives. So what I try to do is say, okay, well, it's unreasonable to think that nothing will happen here, but if it's going to happen, how can we mitigate what some of your concerns are? I've been pretty successful in talking through. I haven't made everybody happy,
Yeah.
but I've been pretty successful of addressing, some, hopefully most of the concerns that come out. There are some people that, no matter what I do, will just can't be happy, and at some point I have to say that I tried and keep moving on.
The criticism of you don't live where you build these things, how do you address that?
Well, you're right. I don't live in Beverly, but I also do development in Manchester where I do live. I mean, if you look at some of the projects that we're doing, I can see them from my house. So I can't, we do business in all kinds of areas. I will tell you that we do try to design and build everything as if it were our own, and as if we did live there. And we can't catch anything. I'll be the first to tell you, sometimes we make mistakes, but when we do, the worst thing that can happen is have all the people just talking to each other about it. Just pick up the phone and call me, and we'll see if we can address it. So that's the only way I can deal with it. If I'm not living there, I can't witness it firsthand, but if you do, let me know.
Why do developers tend to buy historic properties and think tearing them down is going to cause them no trouble? That here's this old house, I'm going to tear it down and build something new, and the community's not going to get upset about it.
It's not in our business plan to go out and look for historic buildings. Matter of fact, I didn't. I thought this was a block that needed, that there wouldn't be anybody out there that didn't agree that it needed to change. Mm-hmm. So had I recognized it, I would have either thought twice about possibly building it. Remember what I said about certainty of outcome. And if there's going to be a long process, and if the answer is that it needs to come down, then first of all, I probably would have approached it a lot differently. What I'm starting to do now, like going through and figuring out my code issues and my structural issues and all the stuff that's ongoing about the press box as we speak, I would have done a lot of that due diligence work before I even bought the property. I would have put it under agreement, I would have gone through and I would have tried to understand what are the odds. If my plan requires it to come down, A, is it the right thing to do? B, if it has to happen, what is the process going to be, and evaluate what are the odds are that it actually happens. If it doesn't look like it's going to fit into my plan, then I just wouldn't buy it.
Now, at the demolition delay, I had said we should all sort of get together, try and figure out what can be done. And I talked about the Essex National Heritage Commission. It's a group that has a lot of business partnerships, things like that. What is the feasibility of saying we would like to really try to save this? Maybe we should bring other partners on board, or just try and throw out ideas and see what could work, or do you handle everything pretty much in-house? I mean, what's the feasibility of maybe asking for help and going to other preservationists and seeing if they think it's worthwhile or not?
As I said when we started our dialogue back down in the Mass Historic office, I'm totally open to those ideas. You know, my mind, maybe I'm a little bit ahead because it all has to be, it's all economically driven. You know, what is that use and what's the potential revenue source that can come out of what that source is, which can make some of these economically feasible. So in my mind, maybe I run ahead too fast and I don't necessarily slow down and think about some of those. In the spirit of what we're talking about now, if there are other ideas out there that can, you know, I think the market is very strong for rental housing, in that market rate rental housing, not affordable housing in that market. If there's a better use, or there's a use that I'm just not aware of, bring it on. I am totally open to other ideas, but we have to dive into the possibilities relatively quickly to determine, is there something economically feasible here or not? Because we can't just, unfortunately, and I'm sure you see this in your preservation world, is that there's just not a lot of people who are ready to just restore buildings for the sake of restoring them and then having them sit there. They got to have a use, and they've got to be able to have a life that helps pay for all this.
Definitely. That is, I have to say, that's an accusation that preservationists get all the time, that we want to save things just because it's old, and we want to keep it as a vintage hotel. No one had ever said that. We said, you look at the other buildings around, like the Depot, which is not currently a train station ticket office. It's a restaurant now. It's been updated so that it does make money. And the Casa de Luca, which was another railroad hotel, again, finds a modern use. I think that's what we were all advocating, and people tried to say we wanted to make it a museum and bring it back to a hotel and make it look exactly like it did back in the day. And I don't think that's an accurate statement. So I definitely do understand trying to make something fit with a modern use. I also think the history of the building is very neat. You have this continuity of that site. We met Trafton relatives as a result of the demolition delay hearing. So the fact that you have these Beverly people, and this is like Beverly history still there, I think from a dollars and cents point of view, historic buildings may not necessarily have something on paper, but there's that extra element there. We even had people recently photographing this building, which not much to look at now, but they've started to take an interest in this and saying, well, it's an old railroad hotel, not just the press box. And the press box, unfortunately, is part of the building's history. No one is denying that, but I use the example of the Grand Resort hotels. And you look at a building like Wentworth by the Sea, what a dump it was. And it was close to being torn down, but there was that small chance that someone could invest in making it a viable business. They obviously wouldn't have fixed it up just because I want to fix something up and make the world a better place. They saw that there could be a use for it, and they made money off of it. But it came so close to being torn down, though.
There's no question. But at the end of the day, I don't mean to sound flip at all.
That's all right.
At the end of the day, even the developer, the Wentworth, had to sit down and say, okay, if I do that, will I attract people to this room, and how much can I charge for these rooms? And it really boiled back down to, now if the audience comes there, or the market is coming there because it's got that history, absolutely there's incentive for the developer to really drive that home. I would say the same thing about the Trafton Hotel, is that if there is a market there and somebody says, I'm going to come to Beverly because this used to be a hotel, I'm going to look at that totally differently. That I haven't learned yet.
Okay.
I just haven't seen it. I do have an appreciation right now, mostly because of you and your group, that there is a lot more to this whole area and to the Trafton Hotel than I ever realized. So as we start to look at what our development options are, even if I can't bring that building up to current codes and to deal with that because it's just not economically feasible, What I certainly can do is make sure that that history of that place and the way it looks is not forgotten, and that whatever we do design can have a nod to the history, and so and put as much of this back into it as we possibly can. I am committed to doing that, quite frankly. I just don't know now whether is it the old building that's incorporated into this, or is it a new building that looks like the old building that's incorporated into this? Code issues, parking, all these things have to come into that overall solution. I did make the statement that I don't know that the outcome will be much different, because again, I do, that building has a lot of issues, and I offered to bring you through it, and anybody else wants to go through it as well.
I'll be taking you up on that offer. I think it would be good
perfectly
to
fine.
show people in Beverly exactly what you're dealing with.
Just remember that what I'm trying to do through this discussion with you is to open up communication and talk about things. It doesn't mean that everybody's going to be happy.
Right.
It doesn't mean that I'm always going to be happy. But there has to be compromise. And for this to work, it has to be economically viable. And we have to understand what the important things are to all of the groups that are affected. And sometimes those are competing. And that's when it becomes hard. And you get certain people who are slamming on me for parking. 1 per unit's not enough. It should be 2. It should be 3. You know, you get other people that say spend your money on historic facades. And so you get a lot of competing issues that come into play. Not all of us are going to be happy, but there's no reason to be calling each other names, and we need just talk. Just like I said before when you said, what frustrates me about Beverly, can I just get everybody in one room and talk about what the issues are?
Right.
That's all that I ask for.
I think I didn't have any clue on what your perspective was either. I just saw you as the developer with ulterior motives, and at that Mass Historic Commission meeting, I had to talk to you because I didn't want you to walk away thinking I was being negative and I had this one view of you. I wanted to know more, and I'm glad that you were willing to sit down and talk with us and give your perspective, because that's something I don't think people in Beverly have any clue on what's going on with your perspective on things.
Well, I appreciate the opportunity to do it.
So that's our interview with Lee Dellicker. What'd you think? Some of you out there will probably be surprised and say, you know, they are working hard to do the right thing in this situation. And there are others who will probably say, this is just damage control. He's trying to put a happy face on dismantling a historic district. Well, many of the things he said cleared up a lot of confusion I had about Windover. But I have to admit, there are still some things I wonder about. Since 2007, people like me have been trying to say these buildings are historic. They're very important and they should be preserved. We've contacted the Salem News. We've contacted Beverly Main Streets. We've written letters. And in most cases, we've said that these buildings make up what could be a potential historic district. The trouble is, no one listened to us because they didn't really want to. Often historians get blamed for only focusing on one thing. All you care about is history. But it seems like there are people in Beverly that despite all these master plans, all they care about is one thing: new development and getting as many people to live in the downtown as possible. That's one ingredient for a successful downtown. But again, that's focusing on just one thing. Now, Lee Dellicker said that as a developer, he doesn't think anyone would use the Tiff. And that's coming from the guy who really worked on this Tiff zone plan. Think about all the hard work that our politicians put into creating the Tiff zone, and now we're told that, in his opinion, it'll probably never be used. So that's about all the time we have for this edition of No Country for Old Buildings. Go onto Facebook and do a search for No Country for Old Buildings, and you can reach me there. So I'd like to thank you for watching, and I hope you tune in to the next exciting edition of No Country for Old Buildings.